series. What I'm going to talk about in the lecture discussion part of this is the politics of the Constitutional Convention. And then we're going to flip over to the philosophy sort of underlying the Constitution as well. The mythic civics view is that the Constitution was in some way divinely inspired, that it was a preordained success. That's one of the things that I still have difficulty with my college students dealing with. They just think, well, of course, it's inevitable that it worked because it's still here. And that means it was inevitable. And the answer is nothing is inevitable. It's also not the product of philosophers per se. It's not egalitarian. The first time the word equality appears in the Constitution in any meaningful way is the 14th Amendment, which guarantees equal protection of the laws, and that's not until 1868. Finally, it's not democratic. I mean, we've added democratic elements to it over time, but initially the only office that was elected under the new Constitution was the House of Representatives, or at least elected by the people, and that's not what we'd usually consider to be democratic. So, I mean, all of these words, all these concepts get thrown around, and people think that this is the Constitution, and it's not, okay? At their best, and I say this sort of knowing what curricular requirements look like, because I've been working with you guys for the last 10, 15 years, and they are seeping into college education now too. But at their best, what they do is try to sort of focus on facts, not myths, make sure people know concrete information, which is useful, and in my line of work, useful for intelligent citizenship. So what we're going to talk about in the front end of this thing is the Constitution as the work of politicians, the Constitution as a political document. And this is a line I took from John Roche's The Founding Fathers of Reform Caucus in Action, which is in the American Political Science Review when I was 5 years old. So it tells you it's a little bit dated. But the idea is still solid. Perhaps the time has come, to borrow Walton Hamilton's fine phrase, to raise the framers from immortality to mortality, to give them credit for their magnificent demonstration of the art of democratic politics. Okay? In other words, they weren't immortals. They weren't unusually perceptive. They were not, channeling the ancients of the wisdom as they were meeting in Philadelphia. They were politicians. And as politicians, they behaved as politicians. And what they were able to craft has managed to last for a long period of time. Okay. Now, the Constitution as a political document, two elements of context here. And Lori Glover did a fabulous job. I always hate following Lori because she's so good, but she did a fabulous job last week giving you sort of the feel of the Articles of Confederation and concerns that were swirling about it. That's the context in which the Constitution is written. There was a massive national debt coming out of the war. The national government couldn't raise money. State currencies were creating enormous inflation. Tariff wars were frustrating the development of any kind of national economy. The Annapolis Conference, which was called to amend the Articles of Confederation to add more authority to regulate commerce, was an utter failure. Only 5 states showed. Significantly, New York and Virginia did, and significantly, Hamilton came from New York and Madison from Virginia. And then, of course, there's Shays' Rebellion, and we talked about that, and Lori talked about that a little bit last week. All this stuff is going on. So for certain elites in society, and Denver, we'll talk about these folks in 2 weeks when we look at Federalist and Anti-Federalist. From the perspective of sort of nationalistic elites, the grand experiment of the revolution is going to hell in a handbasket. Okay, so what do? As Lori mentioned last week, Congress, after the failed Annapolis Conference and after Shays, calls for a convention, and this is a direct quote from Congress's charge, calls for a convention for the sole and express purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. Okay, sole and express purpose of amending the Articles of Confederation. In one of the classic sort of overarching political moves that helped define what the convention ended up looking like and the document it produced ended up looking like, Madison comes into the convention having prepared himself to the teeth with the Virginia Plan. And the Virginia Plan completely ignores the Articles of Confederation. The Virginia Plan became the agenda for the Constitutional Convention. That's an enormous strategic move, because all of a sudden you're playing on Madison's turf. Madison doesn't get all he wants, obviously, and we'll look at that a little bit down the road. But at least he's dictating the terms of the game. He's dictating the tempo of the game. And the Virginia Plan looks more like the final Constitution, certainly, than the Articles of Confederation, and also the New Jersey Plan, which wasn't a complete plan. It was, parts of it were different than the Virginia Plan. But the final Constitution looks more like the Virginia Plan than anything else. And that's because Madison knew what he was doing. He was a master politician. Okay, so Constitutional Convention meets as a response to this perceived demise of the revolutionary hope. The Constitution itself is occasioned by compromise. Now, these guys were from 12 different states. Rhode Island didn't attend. Rhode Island also didn't go to the Congress under the Articles of Confederation very often. Rhode Island was a problem. But the 12 states there, delegates from the 12 states there, had national interests. Okay, one of the things we're going to talk about is the fact that all of these people wanted a stronger national government. I mean, they didn't go to Philadelphia to write a limited constitution. They went to Philadelphia to write a constitution that created a stronger national government. Now, how much stronger? Open question, and we'll look at that in a second too. But they were driven by local, selfish, parochial interests, but they were also concerned with national and public interests. They were in a world, and again, Lori talked about this last week, where to the south you have the Spanish, to the west you have the French, to the north you have the British, and for the last few hundred years in Europe, these countries have been fighting one another, and you're surrounded by them, right? And again, there's nothing inevitable about whatever they were going to produce seizing the day. So the goals of the delegates at the convention itself were basically threefold. One, create a stronger national government. Secondly, to do that, they had to agree among one another. Okay, they had to produce something that they could send to Congress, and the Congress would send to the states. So they had to agree with one another. But that wasn't enough. The secondary goal, and think about this, it makes perfect sense, is not only did they have to agree with one another, but they had to write something that they could get the states to agree to. Because if the states didn't agree to it, it wouldn't be ratified. And if it's not ratified, all their work is for naught. So there are two levels of compromise necessary. One, so people in Philadelphia can agree to create a document. And then secondly, to have something that they can sell to the states, okay? Now, those are constraints. Those are real constraints on people trying to craft something completely anew. All right, when I teach this stuff, I teach it in terms of compromises at the convention, because these different interests required compromises. And instead of just listing out a whole host of compromises and hoping that people remember them longer than the period of time that it takes them to slap it on paper for the exam, what I try to do is simplify things. And what I talk about is three essential approaches to the problem of compromise. One is a punt. Secondly, split the difference. And third, vagueness. Now, a punt basically says we can't score now, so we will give the ball to the other side in hopes of coming back to this and getting the score the next time. Okay, so you're basically treading water. Split the difference is I get some, you get some. It's a positive sum game. Vagueness is agreeing on language, but not necessarily agreeing on what that language means. Okay, so you have those three baskets, those three categories, and you can put the compromises in those three baskets. And what I'll talk about today are under the punt category, adding new states and voting. Okay. Split the difference, the election of the president, dealing with the question of slavery, and then representation. And finally, vagueness, and we're still playing this game today, federalism, the specific division of power between the states and the national government. Everybody wanted the national government to have more power. The question was how much, and how much would be left to the states. Okay, so those are the three baskets into which I try to organize the compromises at the convention, which were driven by, in large measure, political parochial concerns. Okay, let's start with new states. How will new states be admitted into this union? Remember, the Articles of Confederation creates for the first time the United States of America. That's the first article in the Articles of Confederation. This confederation shall be called the United States of America. Okay, so you had at that time 13 states, right? They're all states, but you're also sitting on the eastern edge of a continent that stretches a long way. And the Congress, under the Articles of Confederation, had passed Northwest ordinances, I believe, in 1784 and 1787. And these Northwest ordinances sort of organized the territories to the west. Okay? It was clear that the eastern seaboard was going to extend into the interior of the country, and that new states would be admitted. Now, the question would be, what would their status be? Okay, and when would they be admitted? So the tensions here are between states that currently exist wanting to maintain their authority, their power, what we sometimes call states' rights. And you're going to see that in the slides, I refer to states' rights and states' power. How much power will states have in this? And then the national notion that, in fact, this is going to extend. Republican government has a certain sphere. You'll have to have new states along the way as more territory is brought in. And overlaying all of this and the entirety of the convention is the question of slavery. Oftentimes people say, because Franklin's at the convention, he was the head of the Abolitionist Society in the United States. Why didn't they abolish slavery? And the answer goes back to those first goals. Remember, they had to agree among themselves, and they had to have something they could sell to the states. You advance abolishing slavery, you have no agreement in Philadelphia, you have nothing to send to the states. So slavery is a given. The question is, how are you going to deal with it? Okay. And this is a question that these politicians had to deal with. They couldn't come to a consensus on this question of new states. So what they did is punt. Okay. Now, one of the things that they tell you when you go to PowerPoint school, and those of you who have suffered through my presentations in the past know this about me. I did not go to PowerPoint school, so I never learned that you don't throw tons of text on a PowerPoint slide. All right. That said, here's tons of text, and you've got access to these PowerPoint slides, what we now call slide deck. You've got access to them, so you can just rip this stuff off, because it's not mine, it's the Constitution, right? So this is how they punted the compromise for new states. And I do red and blue just to sort of highlight different parts. New states may be admitted by the Congress into this union. So we know who's going to admit new states. Okay, but then the question is when, under what conditions? But no new state shall be formed or erected from within the jurisdiction of any other state, nor any state be formed by the junction of two or more states or parts of states, without the consent of the legislatures of the states concerned. What that does is protect the existing states. Virginia is not going to be sliced up unless Virginia agrees to be sliced up, or 1864 comes along and Lincoln needs more electoral votes. But that's a different story. Okay, the states protected themselves. No state will be formed out of another state, and you won't be merging small states together unless they agree. So they protected themselves. They protected their continued existence. But what does this say about when new states will be admitted? What does this say about whether they'll be free or slave? What does this say about how much population they should have? And the answer is, it says nothing about any of those things. All it tells you is that Congress will make these decisions. New states will be admitted by Congress into this union. There's nothing conditioning Congress's power. It just says Congress will do this. So this is a punt. They put off the difficult question of the context and the requirements, the criteria for admissions of new states to somebody down the road. They didn't have to deal with it. They punted the problem. All right. Second compromise, as we're working in this compromise basket of punt, the right to vote. The basic question here is political power. The bulk of the population in the country at this point in time is in the North, okay? And much of the population in the South is slave. So, and slaves didn't have political rights, not shockingly, in Southern states. So who's going to choose the national government? Okay? Again, same basic political constitutional question. States' rights and power as opposed to nationalism. At least at the convention, and ultimately in his career, Madison was much more of a majoritarian than he was any kind of a devotee of state rights. Madison's Virginia plan had senators apportioned based on population and representatives in the House based on population. That would favor larger states. That was not going to go anywhere because of the smaller states, not all of which were Southern. But this was a major concern. So you have concerns about states' rights and power against a more nationalistic perspective, right? There are also questions of equality and consent, because these are all children of the Enlightenment. They're all lowercase Lockean liberals, and they know that everyone has the same natural rights and that government's legitimacy comes from consent. So that's lurking in the background as well. So there's no consensus in the Constitutional Convention as to who should get to vote. So this is what they do. They punt. All right. And again, more constitutional text with the article and the section and subsection there. The House of Representatives shall be composed of members chosen every second year. So the entire House will turn over, theoretically at least, they'll all be up for election every 2 years. Okay. And they will be chosen by the people of the United States. So who are those people? Because some states had universal manhood suffrage, which meant all white guys could vote. Other states had qualified suffrage, property requirements and things like that. And they couldn't agree as to whether you should let everyone vote, some subsection of everyone, or some very small group. It depended on the state. So what they did is punt this. The red text: electors in each state, that's voters, shall have the qualifications requisite for the electors of the most numerous branch of the state legislature. So just take Texas, for example. If you could vote for the assembly, you could vote, or the Texas Assembly, you could vote for the representative to the House of Representatives at the national government. What that means is states determined who would vote in federal elections, right? So this punts it to the states. If you want to have everyone vote, you can have everyone vote. If you only want to have some subset of everyone vote, you can do that too, okay? So that just punted this back to the states. There was no national decision. There is no right to vote per se in the Constitution. The right to vote with certain limitations because of amendments belongs to the determination of the states, okay? Then we'll come back to this in a second when we talk about representation. Remember, I said Madison wanted to have the Senate and the House vote proportion based on population. This freaked out, technical social science term, this freaked out smaller states because they thought that they'd be clubbed to death by these larger states with more representatives. So each state gets 2 senators, okay? Now, how are those senators chosen? They'll be chosen by the legislature thereof. So the legislature can choose them directly. They can give the appointment to the governor. They can have a popular election. This is punted to state legislatures as well. So the whole question of who gets to vote is just left to the states, right? And each state can do this differently. The second basket of compromises, split the difference compromises. One is the election of the president. Huge question. Everybody knows the first president is going to be George Washington. including George Washington, by the way, who sat very nobly at the front of the Constitutional Convention. The question is, who's going to be president after George Washington? Okay. Some people wanted Congress to select the president. Madison, for example, in the Virginia Plan, had the Senate selecting the president. Others wanted the states to select the president, okay, in some way, shape, or form. Still, others thought it would be the best method to have a national vote. So the nation would decide by majority vote who the president would be, or plurality, okay? All of these are inconsistent with one another. So the question is, what do? They couldn't come up with an agreement about how to elect the president. And this is one of the things Charlie Flanagan is probably going to talk about, but I'll just foreshadow now. What they did is split the difference. And if you look at Article 2, the article of the Constitution that deals with the presidency, the bulk of it is made up of this text. And this is one of the reasons why you're not supposed to throw large blocks of text up on a screen, okay? But this is the original part of the Constitution, Article 2, Section 1, subsection 2, which is about a third to a half of Article 2. I mean, that's how much text this takes up. What they did here is give everybody a little bit of something. And again, go back to the colored text. And then just read the rest of it tonight, just for the sheer joy of reading too much verbiage. Executive power vests in the President of the United States. He will be elected as follows. Each state shall appoint in such a manner as the legislature thereof may direct a number of electors equal to the whole number of senators and representatives to which the state may be entitled in the Congress. Okay, so notice what's happening here. Who's determining how these electors are selected? The states, the state legislature. So if a state legislature wants to have electors appointed by the governor, they can pass that law. If a state legislature, which would give the governor the power to pick the people who would select the president, they could hold it for themselves, or they could give it one house of the legislature or the other house, or they could say, we're going to choose electors by having a popular vote for them. Okay, so everybody has the potential to get something out of this. Okay, now the second paragraph can be summed up this way. If there is not a majority in the Electoral College, this thing that they invented, this Rube Goldberg mousetrap sort of a device. If there's not a majority in the Electoral College, then the top two finishers will be voted on by the House of Representatives. Okay, so again, the assumption was after Washington was gone, there wouldn't be anybody of sufficient national status so that they would get a majority of electoral votes. In that case, the House of Representatives chooses the president, and the Senate comes into play then later. All right. So those who wanted the federal government, the Congress, to select the president have this as a fallback, and they're assuming that they'll be able to do this because you won't have majority vote for an individual once you get past Washington. Obviously, they didn't foresee the beginning of political parties because that changes everything. Okay, but these were men of the times and creatures of their concerns. They were trying to come to an agreement. Now, this didn't work, and it didn't work the first election after Adams is elected. Jefferson's vice president, and Jefferson ran against Adams. So that was problematic. But even more problematic than the 1796 election was the 1800 election, where Hamilton and Burr tied. And so the vote was thrown in the House of Representatives. This makes the musical Hamilton possible, by the way, which is a good outcome. But it obviously was the case that people weren't really voting for Burr, but the Federalists rallied behind Burr because they thought he'd be more sympathetic to their cause over time than Jefferson. And Burr would have been, because Burr was very much a chameleon of a political actor. So after Jefferson finally gets the vote and Hamilton swings a state delegation, Burr gets PO'd, which means permanently outraged, and ends up shooting Hamilton dead. They add the 12th Amendment to the Constitution. And how do you fix problems with too many words? You add more words. Oops, where did it go? You add more words. There you go. The 12th Amendment is designed to fix the compromise that was the Electoral College, which arose simply because they couldn't agree on how to elect the president. Okay. So that was their response to that. Another compromise that sort of split the difference is the basic question of slavery. All sorts of issues here: scope of national power, scope of state power, property rights in owning other human beings, human rights in not owning other human beings. All of these things are on the table in Philadelphia. No consensus at the convention. So what they did is split the difference. This is Article 1, Section 2, subsection 3. This is the representation and taxation clause. The South wanted to count slaves as part of the population to determine their representation in the House of Representatives, because then they would get more representatives. The North said, you're not going to let them have any political power. They're your property, so you can't count them at all. So what do they do? What's the compromise? The 3/5 clause is the compromise. 3/5 of all other persons. The word slavery doesn't occur in the Constitution until the 13th Amendment. So what this does, the South gets something. They get to count 3/5 of their slaves for determining how many representatives they're going to have in the House. And the North gets something too. They get to count 3/5 of slaves in the South when they determine tax burdens from various states. Okay, so each gets a little bit of something. Then Article 1, Section 9 allows Congress to prohibit importation of foreign nationals as slaves after 1808, which is what Congress did. So Congress ended the legal slave trade, at least international slave trade, in 1808. That's sort of a win for more abolitionist kinds of forces. And finally, there's the Fugitive Slave Clause of Article 4, Section 2, which says that if a slave escapes to another area, a free area, that state has to help the owner get that slave back. Just like if someone took my 2019 Subaru Forester to Oklahoma, Oklahoma would be bound and determined to help me get it back because it's my property. So too slaves. So too the Fugitive Slave Clause. Okay, so everybody gets a little bit of something. The final split the difference compromise is representation. Okay, who will be populating Congress? And again, questions of states' power, national power, and majoritarianism against sectional interests. Slavery is here. No consensus. So what do? They split the House representation in the House and in the Senate. The House is based on population, but the Senate is not. The Senate is based on state status, which means that states will always be able to block legislation at the national level, even if they don't have a majority of the population in the country. Okay. And again, think slavery, because that's one of the major issues that was in play here. And this way, the South could stop the North from legislating in a way that might undermine slavery. And that helped hold the Union together, at least until 1861. Now, the last compromise, and this is where this part of our story ends, is in vagueness. Okay. The basic question here is Goldilocks. The Grimm brothers fairy tale, Goldilocks and the Three Bears, which is very grim. They're aptly named because in the end, in the original, Goldilocks gets eaten by the bears. And so you read this story to your children at night, and the lesson is do what your parents tell you to do, or you'll be eaten by bears, which is a pretty compelling way of disciplining your children, and very German, I will say too. But the basic question is Goldilocks. How do you have just enough power in the federal government, but not too much, right? And different states and regions had different interests here. Some wanted the national government to be really, really powerful. Hamilton wanted to abolish the states. I mean, he didn't get it written into the Constitution. He wasn't at the Constitutional Convention for most of it. He came back at the end. So some people had absolutely no regard for states. Other people thought that states were the fundamental building blocks of the nation. So these are competing interests held by politicians from these various states, right? So what do? They leave the text vague. Congress has the power to make all laws in the enumerated powers of Article 1, Section 8. There are 17 enumerated powers. How do you know Congress has the power to declare war? Because it says in Article 1, Section 8. How do you know it has the power to regulate commerce? It says in Article 1, Section 8. But Section 8 ends with the 18th subsection. Congress shall have the power to make all laws which shall be necessary and proper for carrying into execution the foregoing powers. The Goldilocksian dimension of this is what counts as necessary. When I was a kid, I used to tell my parents that it was necessary that I would have the car on Saturday night. And they would say, no, Joey, it's not necessary for you to have the car. It would be useful for you to have the car, but you would survive without the car. And I would say, no, I wouldn't, because then I can't go to the Pizza Hut and hang with my chums. And that's necessary because I need to develop as a social being as well as an intellectual being. I was a very, very smart 16-year-old. And they said, oh, you can develop as a social being by having your friends over here. It's not necessary for you to have the car to go to the Pizza Hut. And I said, but it's not the same if my friends come over here. And then I said, besides, what about the women? If I don't go to the Pizza Hut, the women won't have access to this. And my mom, in classic my mom fashion, said, oh, Joey, the women will be fine. And it turns out they were. They really didn't need me around at all. So that's the whole point of that story, other than it demonstrates how pathetic my adolescence was, is that the word necessary has multiple meanings. It can mean useful and convenient, or it can mean vital and crucial, like air is necessary to life. You can't have life without air. Well, is that how people always use the word necessary? Not necessarily, right? Sometimes they use it to mean useful and convenient. What's the constitutional answer to the correct definition of necessary? There isn't one, at least not one that comes out of the Constitutional Convention. John Marshall had an argument for it, McCulloch v. Maryland, but that's not resolved in the Constitutional Convention. They just left it vague. Article 6 of the Constitution is the Supremacy Clause, and it says that the laws of the federal government are supreme, the supreme law of the land, if they're in accordance with the Constitution. But that doesn't answer the question, how broad are those powers, right? And then, of course, the 10th Amendment gets added to the Constitution in the period of what we call the Bill of Rights. And the 10th Amendment says powers that are not delegated to the United States by the Constitution nor prohibited by it to the states are reserved to the states respectively or to the people, which says the states have these reserved powers, what the court comes to call police powers, okay? One crucial thing when you think about the 10th Amendment is that the word expressly, which was in the Articles of Confederation in the second article, is not in the 10th Amendment. When they were debating the amendments in Congress, some kept trying to put the word expressly before delegated. Okay, so it would say the power is not expressly delegated to the United States. All right, that would really limit the power of the national government and suggest it didn't have any implied powers at all. But Madison kept taking necessary out, or excuse me, kept taking explicitly out or expressly out, because he didn't want to hamstring the national government under the Constitution the way the national government was hamstrung under the Articles of Confederation. So federalism is vague as well. And that leaves the development over time and leads to the constitutional crisis that is the Civil War. Okay, so just the takeaway of all of this. Constitution informs, context informed everything that happened at the Constitution, and the meaning of the text, to the degree there was clear meaning of the text, to the people that were in Philadelphia at the time. It was a response to the issues rising out of a specific point in American history. There's nothing magical about it. I oftentimes ask my students, why is there a Third Amendment? And they don't even know what the Third Amendment is, and it's about not quartering troops in homes. I said, why did they put that in the Bill of Rights? Doesn't that seem silly? And they're like, yeah, it is weird. I said, because the British were doing that, and they were working in the context that they knew, and they didn't want government to do that anymore. Okay? There's nothing magical about it. The framers were not philosophers. They were pragmatic politicians, pragmatically working through the problems that they had. with the goal of agreeing with one another and then being able to sell this document to the states. There's no reason to think that their solutions were unchangeable, inevitable, what have you. Now, that being said, Constitution is a political document. Pragmatism can be guided by knowledge. And I will argue in our workshop that it was, that these guys were working from a philosophical tradition that is called the science of politics, flows out of liberalism. And so that's what you see in the Federalist Papers, and those are in your standards as well. In fact, those are your standards. Everything that I've talked about today plugs into at least one of those standards. So, if you want to use the slide deck for your own, feel free to do so, because that's what I touched on in the course of this conversation. All right. That's my email. I can't give you Madison's or Hamilton's. I don't have Lin-Manuel Miranda's, so I can't give you that either. But I open it up for any questions or comments that you may have.